overview of our next release 4.1, which will be starting over this coming weekend, unless you have asked for us not to at this time. So on that, I'm going to hand over to Zach, who will walk us through short PowerPoint and agenda, and then, of course, the actual new features of the release. So thanks for joining, and we'll catch up with you in a minute.
All right, let me just get myself started here. That screen from the beginning. Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Zach Watkins. I'm product support specialist here at Certainty Software. I'm sure I've talked to several of you before as we're working with the system. We're going to be covering the 4.1 release today. So let's just launch in here. So an overview of 4.1 Certainty. There's one major feature update and then a bunch of small quality of life changes. The major feature update is going to be checklist workflow. This is going to allow staged or stepped checklist completion with past responsibility between users along different steps. If any of you have interacted with the action workflow system that we released a couple patches ago, that will be a lot of this will be quite familiar to you, and this will help a lot with multi-stage checklists where you might need to have one user filling out and an auditor confirming or something along those lines. Other features in this release, we're going to cover the translation system import and export, which should be a huge quality of life boon for admins trying to set up checklists in multiple languages. We have a solution to the checklist component problem. I'm sure those of you who have built checklists before have run into the problem of having multiple yes/no answer types for your auto-filled options. We're quashing that little bug finally. Grouped email notifications, which will let you have one email notification for an entire checklist's worth of triggers. That way you don't get spammed by emails when, say, a risk identification notification triggers multiple times on one checklist. And lastly, page level default answer types. This is, again, a quality of life buff that should just make filling out a large checklist or creating a large checklist much, much quicker. We'll start with checklist workflow. So checklist workflow is designed to let you create checklists for multiple users, whether this is a group of users completing different sections of a checklist, an auditor reviewing a checklist completed by another user, or the core concept behind this is responsibility. Each workflow is comprised of several steps, and each step will have a select group of users as responsible, meaning they'll be the ones interacting with and completing the checklist before passing it on to the next step, and therefore the next responsible user. Important to note here, a workflow could be entirely the responsibility of one user, with a potential use case for this being a long checklist that's completed over several days, where the details of the submission should not be sent to report system until the checklist is entirely completed. Mandatory questions can also be made non-enforceable or non-enforced on certain steps as necessary. This could be especially useful when you might have an auditor who has mandatory answers, but the initial user who fills out the first part of the checklist shouldn't need to answer those. So workflow is kind of split up into two steps or two parts. The first one is steps here. A step is made up of three things: name, attributes, and responsibility. The name of the step, as well as optional descriptions, pardon me, are used for setting up the workflow and mostly on the admin side. End users won't really interact all that much with the name or description here. In fact, I don't think they'll even see the description at any point. What the users will interact with is the attributes. So attributes, there's a bunch of different attributes here. Completed answers can be edited, editable, hidden, or view only. This just means when the step is passed to the next responsible user, they will have all the questions from the previous step answered however the previous user answered them, and this responsible user can either edit, see, or maybe even have the questions entirely hidden from them. Date and site can also be edit or view only. Date and site are normally locked, so by the default behavior of the site is to keep these two locked, except from the admin perspective. Now, if you have a checklist that's either filled out at multiple sites or filled out across multiple days during the different steps of the workflow, we can actually change that midway if need be. Mandatory questions, photos, and files can also now be enforced or optional. I mentioned this before, where you could have a question that's mandatory for auditors, but not for the initial user. So that's what kind of the use case here. Mandatory photos and files are something that we added last patch to allow an admin to set up mandatory photos, which is a much requested feature. But this just lets you have that optional across different steps, just in case the auditor needs to take a photo and the first user doesn't, or something along those lines. Checklists can also be included or excluded from reporting. So this is, like I mentioned before, if you have a checklist that is filled out over a couple of days, but only the final step of the checklist or only the completed checklist is useful to your reporting, or perhaps necessary for your reporting if there are different parts of the checklist that rely on earlier parts. This means that you can have a checklist that is incomplete but saved, but not yet part of reporting. So it won't show up in dashboards, it won't show up in reports, and it won't show up in the Power BI section business intelligence dashboard. That was all attributes. Lastly, there's also the responsibility part of steps. Responsibility defines who can interact with and edit a checklist on any given step. You can have multiple responsible users, and this ties in a little bit to the multiple user edit privileges that were the previous system to kind of govern this aspect of our business. With multiple user edit privileges, you could add additional users to a checklist, and that checklist would appear in all of those users' completed checklist archive. So they'd all be able to go back in, edit, make any changes. This system worked all right. This entire checklist workflow is kind of a major expansion on that idea. But this particular step with responsibility, if you have multiple responsible users, it acts in the same way. You have multiple users who have the checklist in their completed checklist archive, and thus multiple people can go in and make any changes they need to make before passing on to the next step. Got a little visual. We'll go into a quick guided walkthrough of the dashboard, the site once we're through, but here's just a picture of attributes and responsibility from the step builder in checklist workflow. So you can see we've got all of our completed answers, date, site, mandatory questions and files, include checklist and reporting, and these are all toggleable. You can lock a checklist, which means that when you pass, when the step is locked, nothing can actually be changed about the checklist. This is mostly useful if there's just a visual confirmation step for, say, an auditor or a reviewer who needs to go in, look at everything, say, yep, all these questions are answered correctly, pass to the next step, but don't actually change anything. And then secondarily, we have the responsibility here. Reports created by reports to site manager. All of these you may have seen before in the either notification system or the action workflow. And this just defines, this just defines who can interact with the checklist on that current step. The second part of workflow is the workflows themselves. Workflows are made up of two parts, details and steps. Workflow details include the name, description, and what checklists the workflow is attached to. Importantly here, one workflow can be attached to multiple checklists, and one checklist can actually be attached to multiple workflows. When a user is starting a new checklist that has workflows as an optional attachment to them, they will be able to choose which workflow they want to be slotted into when they start the checklist. So this could be potentially used to create multiple workflows for the same checklist, but perhaps different sites need to handle different workflows. Workflow details, like I said, name and description. Just like with steps, this is only really for the admin side. The end user, I believe, will see the name of the workflow, but they'll never see the description. That's primarily for your own backend bookkeeping. Steps, however, workflows are made up of one or more steps. So we covered what a step looks like in the previous two slides. Each step can transition to one of a list of step options that you make available, and we'll see what that looks like in just a moment. However, if there are no transition options selected for a given step, the workflow will terminate at that step. And then steps can also be given the option to transition to previous steps, allowing for very simple looping This is especially relevant if you want to have some kind of a conversation going between, say, a inspector and a reviewer or something along those lines, where the reviewer or the inspector could make a comment about something, mark it as risk. The reviewer asks for an explanation, passes it back to the initial inspector, who maybe gives their explanation and passes it back to the reviewer. So this is what the workflows look like on the back end. So we've got details at the top there. Like I said, you need a name. Description is optional and is primarily for your own bookkeeping, so you don't need to fill that out if you don't want to. And then checklists that it is attached to. So you can see this line audit workflow was attached to the facility safety inspection workflow. You could attach this workflow to multiple checklists, and it would just become an available option for all of those checklists. Workflow steps. So this is what I was mentioning before. We've got 4 different steps that have been attached to this workflow. You can see we transition from the audit initialization to completing the audit, and then to audit review and approval. On completing the audit and audit review and approval, we could pass to multiple steps. So when the user finishes that current step and choose to pass to the next step, they'd have to choose between a couple of different options. And lastly, we have the archive audit. So audit review and approval can transition to archive audit, which has no transition options, and thus the checklist actually terminates, or the workflow, pardon me, terminates there. Other features in 4.1, we've got 3 major quality of life improvements here. The first one is translation, import, and export. So there's going to be 2 new buttons added to the translation page of the administration tab. The first one, import, allows you to import an Excel sheet set up in a certain format, which you'll be able to get from the export, which will load a lot of translations at once. And this is especially relevant for a checklist that might have, or the entirety of a checklist that might have a full translation ready to go. But previously, you'd have to go in, find each individual component, each individual answer type, individual title, and manually enter translation. This change is designed to just rapidly streamline that process, where you'll be able to export the current translations, find all the relevant ones to you, add those translations in, and then import that list back into the system. It'll be automatically uploaded and ready for your users to go with multiple translations. Component duplicates are a problem that has plagued a few of the older databases with a lot of components. So whenever you save and publish a checklist, it will create a copy of all of the previously non-existing components in that checklist. So for instance, if you create a new yes/no answer type, it will create a new yes/no component. This is great for streamlining the checklist creation process, where you might have quite a few old components that you can reuse. However, if you don't reuse those old components, it can lead to duplications. Some of you have probably experienced this, where you have multiple no's in your auto-filled section and you don't know which one to choose. This is especially a headache for my end when I'm designing reports, because all of those have a different unique answer ID. So we've actually just enforced uniqueness on component names. So you can no longer have multiple yes/no answer types. You can tag new components to create uniqueness where necessary, but this will just prevent the creation of 5 different no answer types, 7 different yes answer types, that sort of thing, and just make it a little easier to navigate. And lastly, we have grouped email notifications. So those of you who have used the email notification system might recognize that you create a rule, and that rule will trigger on certain conditions to be met. Perhaps a new checklist is created, perhaps a username has been changed, or an edit privilege has been changed. But this mostly focuses around certain answer types being used. So for instance, if you had a rule that looked for risks in a checklist, then you could have an email sent based on that. Grouped email notifications is designed to make it so that when you have that risk triggering rule, if you have a checklist that is submitted with 9 risks, you don't get 9 emails. So this will be a tick box available for the email notifications that will just let you group all of those 9 emails into one email. And this is mostly just to prevent inbox spam. That is my PowerPoint and all of the features from 4.1. There's also a myriad of small bug fixes, but those will largely be subtle and unnoticed. We are just going to jump over to the main website right now and do a quick demo of the checklist workflow system. So you can see it will be available in the administration tab here, right next to action workflows under checklist workflow. There we go. So first things first, when you create a new workflow, you do need steps to exist before you can create a new workflow. So you can see these are the ones I set up for our little demo here. We've got a 4-step process from audit initialization to the archive. These 2 center steps are designed to be able to step to the previous, move to the previous step if something is declared incorrect or insufficient in previous steps. So from any of these, we can just edit. Probably seen interfaces like this before on the website. We have a name, description, and then all these toggles can be toggled to however you prefer. Editable. In this case, this is our first step, so everything is editable, and mandatory questions and files and images are optional. This means that a user can fully save an incomplete checklist to pass on to the complete checklist step. And then the only persons with rights to be granted shared access are the users with access to the previous step. And because this is the first step, this just means the user who starts it. However, we also have a couple of users who can view the step at any given point. This means they cannot interact with the step, but they do know what's going on. This is a system we introduced with Action Workflow and we found quite useful. This means you can have, say, the person a given user reports to be able to see the progress on a given step without being able to interact. So they just know what step has been gotten to for tracking purposes. So that's what step 1 will look like. And then step 2, where we get a little bit more in detail, this is the completing the audit. The site is only visible now. This means site cannot be changed. However, date can be. Completed answers are visible. That means they can be viewed by this current user, but not changed. And again, we've got a bit more detail on who can be granted shared access, who can view the checklist, that sort of thing. Audit review and approval, very similar to before. Everything is visible now with mandatories being optional. This just means that this step doesn't really interact with the checklist all that much beyond rubber stamping and saying, all right, it's all good to go. And finally, archive audit. This step is locked entirely, so no interaction can be done by the responsible user. And this is the termination step where there's no further steps to pass to, and thus the checklist, the workflow is complete and ready for reporting. And then I actually had this screen in our slides here, but this is just the workflow itself. We can see we've got the 4 steps that we just covered here, and they transition back and forth between each other. So this audit initialization transitions to completing the audit, which could go back to the initialization or forward to review and approval. Review and approval can go back to completing the audit or forward to archive audit, which goes nowhere and thus terminates. So that's checklist workflow. It's a pretty exciting new system. It should be very useful for our multi-stage and multi-step checklist submissions, which I know has been a requested feature for some time. But we finished a tiny bit under time. Hopefully I wasn't speaking too fast. I am going to stop my screen share here and open up the room to questions. So you should be able to use the raise hand feature if you have any questions. And we'll get started with that here. No questions so far. Any closing thoughts yet?
No, I think that's great. Thanks, Zach.
You're welcome.
Obviously, there's a few other features in there, but I think they're relatively self-explanatory. The translation, export, import, and a few of the other features. But of course, if you have any questions, by all means, don't hesitate to shout, and we will be posting this recording on our website shortly.
Indeed. All right. Well, in that case, if there are no questions, I guess we will complete things here. Thank you all so much for attending. It's this is the first webinar I've done, so I hope I did well. And
Perfect.
yeah, thanks for listening, guys.
Take care, everyone.
Have a good day.